And imagine it goes something like this. It's 8 p.m. You just put the kids to bed, and you're sitting down for a quiet dinner with your spouse, or maybe your increasingly significant other, or your dog. You know, you can choose the example. And all of a sudden, the phone rings, and you check your caller ID, and it doesn't seem to be a telemarketer. And you pick it up, and it's your alma mater. And they say, look, basically, your $100,000 in tuition wasn't enough. We'd like you to give some money today. Would you be willing to do that? And I think a lot of what we've learned today has really taught us about how we can get these suckers, i.e. you, on the other end of the phone to give. What I want to talk about is basically what drives the person on the other end of the line, the caller, to actually make that call to reach out to you and all the other alums at their university. That's where we're going to start. We're going to move to some other context in a minute. But when I've been studying call centers, and particularly university call centers where people try to raise money to support lots of good causes, there's been a really surprising result for me, which is if you take a look at the work, it's pretty unpleasant. So the average call center has 100% turnover every 2 months. So if you imagine the hiring costs, the training costs, it's not pleasant to try to keep these people employed and try to restaff your jobs. You only have one task. You get to make these calls. It's not fun. You have to use a standardized script because what we're trying to do, of course, is boil this down to a science, make the shortest possible ask, and get the most money for it. And based on what we learned from Noah this morning, I'm not going to tell you what the rejection rate is because it might discourage you all from giving. But it's quite high. So very rarely does an alum ever actually give. So not surprisingly, the callers are not very motivated. And the question is basically, what can we do? What can we do to help maintain their motivation, to help them persist, keep making calls, and keep trying to get all of you to donate your hard-earned money? And I think what's really fascinating about this is that it has a couple of different implications. One is for those of you who are leaders or managers. What can you actually do to motivate your own employees who are doing this kind of work? And two, for those of you who have the great fortune of raising funds, how do you actually keep yourself motivated to do this work? And I was blown away a couple years ago when I started doing this research. We found that a 5-minute intervention caused, for the average caller, 500% increases in weekly amount of money raised, which is a staggering amount of money. So if you want to quantify that, we have 23 callers who, in an average week, bring in an extra about $38,000 for the university. And so if you think about it, and you wanted to come up with, what does that intervention look like? What happens in those 5 minutes that fundamentally transforms the motivation and success of the callers? Take a second and try to answer that question. And I won't be collecting your answers. But what I will show you is what about 1,000 executives from Fortune 500 companies, Air Force and Army generals, and nonprofit leaders think are the most effective interventions, and why those are dead wrong. So I'll just give you a moment to reflect on that, in part so you too can be wrong. But I actually have a hunch that many of you will hit on the right intuition here, which took me quite a while to figure out, and I think that a lot of you are going to be much quicker than I was. All right, I think you've had enough time. So these are the most common answers. People say pay for performance. If you give the callers incentives, they'll work harder, and of course they'll bring in more donations because they get a cut. This is actually a problem in fundraising. So the call center, when I first walked in, had tried a pay for performance initiative. And there's this little issue when it comes to raising donations from alums, which is if they don't give by credit card, which is about 70% of people who don't in this particular call center, you have to wait 3 months for the pledge to actually come in. And so we have lots of callers who are very excited to say, yes, actually, Phil just donated $100,000 today. I'll take my cut, and then I quit the job before the university ever finds out that Phil had no intention whatsoever of giving. So pay for performance turns out not to work. There are also some ways in which it's illegal in fundraising. We can get into that if anyone's interested. Other ideas that come up pretty regularly, promotions. Unfortunately, we can't promote the callers because there isn't any other work to be done in the organization. We can give them higher titles, but they don't seem to care a whole lot. We've tried relaxing the scripts. That doesn't work either because, strangely, you find these $400 phone bills on calls to China where there seems to be an alum, but you can never actually find a donation recorded for it. We can try to get the callers to compete. And pretty soon it becomes clear that there are 1 or 2 callers who are absolute stars. And no matter how hard I work, I can't ever beat these people. We can try to give the callers a little bit of recognition. Unfortunately, because so few people give, it's actually quite hard to find anything to recognize them for. And finally, we can try to give them some breaks. And that doesn't work because they actually just stop doing their jobs. So we were sort of at a loss when I was called in to work with this particular call center. And as has been true for many of the organizations today, I have to keep them anonymous, but their mascot rhymes with the Wolverines. So I went to the call center one day, and I was really impressed and disturbed by a sign that I found on the computer screen of one of the callers. He'd actually made this his screensaver, and later it was posted right in front of his desk. And the sign said this. I'll show it to you in a second, but for effect, I'd better say it. It says, "Doing a good job here is like wetting your pants in a dark suit. You get a warm feeling, but no one else notices." And he was kind enough to lend it to me so I could scan it. I thought that this was actually a very touching statement about how little information the callers had about why their work mattered and how it made a difference. And I thought in particular this is really interesting because the callers are doing very important work. When they do raise money, it goes to lots of good causes, right? It funds student scholarships. It helps many of the faculty members in the room support their salaries, pays for new buildings, conferences like this, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so the question is, can we inspire these callers by showing them how their work really makes a difference and telling them where the money goes? So I started talking to the managers of the call center about this, and I said, look, we can actually give the callers some information about how their jobs really make a difference. And the manager said, well, actually, normally we hide that because we don't really like anyone to know where the money really goes. But after a little bit of prodding, we were able to get some statistics. And we found out that in this particular organization, about 65% of total donations raised go directly to student scholarships, which is a pretty exciting outcome. And so the managers devised a plan. They said they were going to basically create a big event where they were going to announce this and try to inspire the callers and help them understand that their money really does a lot of good. They designed the event. They delivered the speech. They shared the statistic. And there was no change whatsoever in the callers' effort, motivation, or performance. And the realization I had finally, this is about 6 months later, and for some of you it took only 6 minutes, was that the information shouldn't actually come from the leaders here. That the leaders have a huge opportunity to outsource this inspiration by bringing in the scholarship students to tell their stories themselves. And so even though the leaders feel responsible for communicating this information, there might be another person, that scholarship student or group of them, who really benefited from the donations, who's in the best position to tell the story in a meaningful, compelling, inspiring way. And so we designed a little intervention to see what happened when we brought in a scholarship student to tell his story, talk about how he got a scholarship, how it had made a difference in his life, and then follow up to track whether the callers actually worked harder and worked more effectively as a result. And so there are a number of different versions of this experiment. I'll give you the simplest design, which is there's a control group of callers that has no exposure to a scholarship student. And then there's an intervention group that gets to meet the one scholarship student for only 5 minutes. And then we're going to measure a couple things that the callers do before and afterward. We're going to measure how much time they spend on the phone. We'll measure how many calls they actually make, and ultimately how much money they succeed in raising. So this is a basic design. And when I did the first experiment, I looked at the data and I didn't believe them. I asked my poor research assistants to re-enter all the data. It took 2 months. The same result came out. And here's what it looked like for the number of minutes on the phone per week. So this is the average caller spending about 100 minutes on the phone per week before the intervention. And then afterward, the callers who met that one scholarship student went up to averaging about 300 minutes on the phone per week. Whereas those in the control condition, the green line, actually showed a non-significant change. And what was particularly remarkable about that to me is that nobody changed in the number of hours they worked. So you still have the same length of a shift. You're still on the job the same amount of time, but you've nearly tripled the amount of that time that you're actually on the phone. So I think there are 2 ways to make sense of that. One is to say that these callers now are really hanging on when you try to hang up. And so you can imagine a caller saying, Meg, please don't hang up the phone. I really, really need your donation, and keeping you on the phone longer and essentially having long, drawn-out conversations with the lums who never give. The alternative is that the callers stop staring at their computer screens trying to muster up the courage to make another call and actually get on the phone and make call after call after call and reach more people, trying to hit a higher probability of real donors. And what we find in a follow-up study is support for the latter. So these are data now from another version of this experiment where we look at the average number of calls that you make per hour. And so it turns out before the intervention, the average caller makes about 3 calls in a typical hour. And these are actually reaching 3 potential donors. You dial the phone a lot more times than that, but you can successfully get about 3 people on the phone in an hour. Afterward, that number more than doubles. And the average caller is now making about 6 calls per hour. So this is really exciting, right? The callers are there on the job the same amount of time. They're now working a lot harder. but what is that actually producing? Are they raising more money? And the answer, I probably wouldn't be here telling it to you if it were not yes, but the answer does turn out to be yes. So the first version of this study, we looked at a very poor group of callers who had to contact non-donors. These are people who had never given a dime in their entire lives to the university and probably never will. And the question is, can you actually bring in more money from that group when you've met the scholarship student and you've seen exactly how important your work can be? And here are the results. So the average caller in this particular study goes from about $200 a week to nearly $500 a week when contacting this group of non-donors. So we're looking at, again, more than doubling the amount of money that they raise. So this is pretty exciting. But then what happens when you contact your ordinary donor pool, the people who give every year, that actually have a real likelihood of giving, where your rejection rates are a lot lower? And here's where you see the results that I opened with, where the average caller goes from about $500 a week to over $2,000 a week, which is a pretty dramatic increase. And this is where you see about $38,000 per week from just 23 callers. So this has now been replicated about 7 times. We can do it with different scholarship students, different groups of callers, different kinds of stories. And there are a couple of wrinkles that I found interesting that you might as well. One is to return to Noah's Simpsons analogy. You can think about sort of 2 prototypical callers. You can think about the Ned Flanders and the Homer Simpsons of the world. So the Ned Flanders, highly conscientious, organized, disciplined, dependable, focused, goal-oriented. On the other hand, the Homer Simpsons, maybe a little bit more carefree, or if you're a highly conscientious person, you might say lazy and careless. And the question is, which of those 2 types of individuals would actually respond better to meeting the scholarship student? My intuition was that it was Ned Flanders, who would say, look, I have a strong sense of responsibility. Being successful is important. And now I've got even more data that my work matters. And so I'm going to work harder as a result. What we actually get is the opposite. Basically, Ned Flanders is already at a ceiling. He already sees his work as important. He's already working hard. He's already pretty successful. And there's not a lot we can do with a small intervention like this to boost his performance. These results are almost entirely driven by our Homer Simpsons. So we're able to take the laziest, yeah, dough, like that, the laziest, least focused, least organized employees and give them a reason that the work actually matters by showing them how the funds actually benefit scholarship students. Another interesting wrinkle is thinking about, back to some of Frank's comments. What is, yeah, go ahead, Joel.
Quick question, how did you quantify Flanderness?
Yeah, so we're looking at a survey here of you reporting your own conscientiousness as a caller.
So the self-report.
Yeah, so it's going to be a self-report. Although we've triangulated that with your managers and your coworkers' reports, and the results are the same. Yes?
So in parallel with the contact with the scholarship student, did the script change, or were they given the flexibility for the script to change?
Great question. So initially, no. The initial answer was, we don't want to change the script because we already know what a good script looks like. And so believe it or not, you have about 20 different managers walking around and monitoring the callers to make sure that they don't share any of this information on the phone with alums, which is really unfortunate, right? What's really great about that from a research standpoint is that we know you can get these effects just by working harder, even when the callers aren't delivering different information on the phone. Finally, after 3 different versions of this experiment, the managers agreed to relax the scripts. And then we actually see an even bigger boost, where now the callers can work harder, they can also work smarter. And when they share the information, they get more donations by passing that on, down the line. So one other piece of information that was pretty interesting is we looked at what kind of scholarship student is most motivating. So when you outsource your inspiration, who do you want to bring in to tell that story? And we looked at different types of scholarship students. One of the most interesting differences was, do we look at a highly extroverted, charismatic speaker, or do we look at someone who's more introverted and withdrawn and a little bit uncomfortable about being here? Again, intuitively, I thought it was the charismatic extrovert who would be the most motivating. And again, directly in contrast with what I expected, we found it was the very shy, withdrawn, socially awkward introvert who was more motivating, in large part because the callers were more capable of empathizing with this person. So you see this charismatic person come in. He looks like the next president of the United States, and you're not too worried about whether he gets his scholarship or not because you know he's going to be just fine. On the other hand, the really shy scholarship student who walks in and tells his story about how his life has been so much better as a result of the scholarship makes you realize that there are a lot of other people out there that desperately need your help and are depending on you to raise a great deal of money. So that's a little bit about the fundraisers. Happy to take questions now or moving forward as you have them. But I want to move to some higher impact context now. So the basic idea here is that there are lots of employees who do work that really matters, but don't necessarily get to see their impact. You can think about engineers who design safety procedures and processes for cars, never get to meet their drivers and passengers. You can think about writers who don't get feedback from readers. A couple interesting studies that have been done recently. Turner and colleagues in Israel did a study of radiologists, where they said normally a radiologist is evaluating an X-ray without ever seeing a patient. And what happens if you just put a patient photo in with that X-ray scan? They found that when you put a photo of the patient in, the radiologist felt more empathy for the patient, and they actually objectively became more accurate in making their diagnoses. And the really clever way they did this is they actually had you evaluate the same X-ray now and again in 6 months. And one time it had the photo, the other time it didn't. And the 6 months were, of course, long enough for you to forget that you ever evaluated it in the first place. And you actually caught more medical problems when you saw the patient's photo in that very, very same X-ray. Some of my other work has looked at lifeguards. So lifeguarding was my first job, and I came in expecting to really be able to make a difference and never performed a single rescue. At this point, I can tell you that my total number of times entering the pool was 3, and all 3 days it was over 100 degrees, and I was just cooling off. So one of the things that I really lost sight of in this job is really understanding how my actions made a difference, because I felt that no one would ever really need my help in a pool, because after all, this event never happens. And what I did was, in this particular experiment, I worked with a group of lifeguards and brought in stories about other guards performing rescues. To take something, again, you know this, right? This is why the job exists. You wouldn't be a lifeguard if there weren't potential drowning swimmers to save. But it's really easy to forget that that can happen. And so we found that if you just take 4 stories from the news media and share them with lifeguards about other guards performing rescues, they volunteer to work more hours in the following month. That holds up for 6 months. And they take more action to protect the safety of guests, like yelling at you for running on the pool deck. As much as the guests don't like that, it turns out to be a relevant safety behavior. So this really got me interested in thinking about safety in a more consequential domain, an even more consequential domain than lifeguarding. What I wanted to look at next, and this is a project in collaboration with Dave Hoffman, is hand hygiene. So some of you will know that back in the 1800s, there was a Hungarian doctor by the name of Semmelweis who found that if you were going to, this will obviously only apply to the women in the room, but if you were going to, say, give birth to a child in the 1800s, there was a dramatic difference in the level of risk that you had depending on who was handling your delivery.
You just imply that the women in the room were born in the 1800s.
Thanks, Mike. I was trying to imply that the men are not going to be having babies, but anyway, so if you were delivered by a physician or a med student, you had about a 20% risk level. On the other hand, if you were delivered by a midwife, your risk actually went down 5 times. And so Semmelweis wanted to figure out why this was. And he did some research. And he found out that basically in a lot of these hospitals, physicians and medical students were doing autopsies right before they delivered babies. And yeah, it's disgusting, right? But at the time, we didn't have germ theory. So no one really thought about it. And they were basically carrying diseases from corpses to pregnant women, which ultimately gave them childbed fever and killed many of them. And he said there's a really simple intervention that could change this. All we have to do is require doctors and nurses to wash their hands. And if they do that, then of course they'll be less likely to communicate these germs. So he intervened in a couple hospitals. Deaths went down to about 1%, which was a great change from 20%. And you think the medical profession would get excited about this. In fact, Semmelweis was committed to a mental institution and beaten to death by guards a few days later, and his findings didn't get accepted for another 20 to 30 years. Now, Pasteur and others came along in the late 1800s. It's a long story. And no one's entirely clear on why it happened, but it seemed to have to do with his insistence that, in fact, you could carry germs around with you. So anyway, so what happened was then we have germ theory. Pasteur and Koch and others come along and convince us that you can actually carry diseases on your hands from these kinds of situations. And so now we perfectly understand that it's really important to engage in effective hand hygiene behavior, right? Or do we? So I think this is what Jeff Pfeffer and Bob Sutton would call a knowing-doing gap, where if you ask the average medical professional, the first thing they will tell you is, of course it's important to wash your hands. Of course it's important to gel and soap between every patient visit. But if you look at some of the recent data that Atul Gawande and others have summarized, the average medical professional washes or gels about 1/3 as often as a study suggests he or she should. So this seems like a pretty critical public safety problem, particularly in hospitals where patients are under critical care and can actually be severely harmed and even killed by the simple transmission of a disease or a germ. So Dave and I decided we were going to enter a hospital and really just try to get medical professionals to remember that this action can really have an impact. We found a lot of signs that were highly ineffective. So a typical sign in one of the hospitals that we entered said, 12 steps for washing your hands. Step 1, turn on the faucet. Step 2, put hands under water. Step 3, scrub. Kind of insulting to medical professionals, right? The average nurse or doctor knows how to wash their hands. It's not a how-to problem. In this case, we thought it was a why-to problem. So we think that they essentially don't, on a momentary basis, think about how every single instance of contact with a patient or every instance of not washing their hands could be deadly. And so the question is, what kinds of consequences should we highlight, right? Hand hygiene has two different groups of beneficiaries. One is you, so it protects you, and the other is the patient, who's also protected. And we wanted to compare which of these two types of signs might be more effective. And so here are our actual signs. Note that these are in no way as powerful as they could be, because what we want to do is a really conservative test of who should we mention. Should we say that hand hygiene is good for you, or it's good for the patient? And I'll let you think just for a moment and place your bets. I'll just say that my bet and the medical safety experts were very different, and we were both wrong. But I think the results are actually fairly compelling and straightforward. So here are the results. And you can now see if your bet actually corresponds to the right line. So the blue line is the control group. So by the way, we're measuring here the percentage of soap and gel used in a given dispenser. And one of the really neat things about this study is we can put different signs by different dispensers and then track how much soap or gel is used without ever having to interact with a human being. Now, I do miss interacting with them, but it's really nice to have the objective data on how much product gets used. So here's the control group, no significant change in the amount of product that they use. Where we get the significant change is when we mention the patients. We see a dramatic increase in the amount of usage of an average soap or gel dispenser over about a 2-week period. So we go from about 37% of the total size being used to over 54%, which is a highly statistically significant change. And so the medical safety experts were shocked by this. They said, look, people are self-interested. At the end of the day, if you want to get people to be safe, you have to highlight the consequences for them and make them realize that it's good for them to wash their hands. But if you think about this in a medical context, I think the story is a little more complicated than that. And if you think about house, I think this is actually, this is pretty much the story, right? So a typical medical professional, there's a lot of evidence, is pretty overconfident about their own immunity and invulnerability. If you look at research, you get lots of quotes like, I'm a doctor, I'm protected. I almost wear a superhero cape. Nothing can actually hurt me. Now, some of this might be arrogance or narcissism among some medical professionals. But another way to look at it is to say, look, if you look at the daily experience of somebody working in a hospital, it's actually the case that they come in contact with a lot of germs and a lot of diseases and don't get sick very often. And so a lot of medical professionals will interpret that as evidence that either they came in with superior immune systems or they built them up through working in the hospital. On the other hand, if you take a medical professional looking at a patient, they're going to be a lot more realistic, right? So you know that patients are, by definition, in many situations, a vulnerable population. We also know that doctors and nurses have often taken pretty serious professional oaths to say that essentially they're supposed to first do no harm. And of course, if you fail to wash your hands, you could consider that an act of doing harm. So this is just a little bit on how even just mentioning the word patient, we're not bringing in the patient. We're not telling really gruesome stories about how patients were harmed by a failure to wash. We're just mentioning that single word, and seems to be enough to really drive people to engage in better hand hygiene. Now, if you're really nice to Mike Norton, he'll tell you about some of his ideas for making this even stronger, which include asking people to wear a scarlet letter when they're caught not washing their hands, and then they have to wear it until they catch someone else. So that's a little bit on the safety side. One thing you might be noticing at this point is we've looked at lots of different groups of people who do pretty high impact work. So the fundraisers, their work really matters, right? The radiologists, the lifeguards, medical professionals, all of their jobs really make a difference. And I think one of the somewhat unfortunate features of a lot of the organizations that we work with and that I've had a chance to study are that a lot of people do jobs that are more ordinary in their impact, that don't necessarily change lives or save lives, but still matter in small ways. And the question is, can we take some of these insights and apply them to more ordinary everyday jobs? And that's where I want to go next. So this project started in the context of an employee support program. Some of you actually have managed these programs, so feel free to jump in and correct me where I slip. But basically, a lot of companies now, especially companies in the food and retail industries where salaries tend to be low, have designed these really interesting programs that are often called employee assistance programs, employee support programs. And the basic idea is to let you get help if you're an employee, if you need it. So often there's a list of life qualifying events. It might be something like a spousal disability, a natural disaster that's destroyed your house, some kind of medical problem, something where you can essentially make ends meet and you need financial support. And what most of these companies will do is they'll ask their own employees to donate, and then they'll put in place some kind of matching procedure. And so I was called in to do a project on one of these companies that had been running an employee support program for about 10 years. And they wanted to do an evaluation of what they were up to and where they should move. And they basically said that these programs are about receiving support. That if you get support from the company, basically you'll turn into Dwight Schrute. That all of a sudden you'll feel like the company cares about you, that they've got your back, that they're a really good company, and because you've received support for them, you're going to reciprocate by then, of course, becoming more committed, working harder, et cetera. And we were basically asked to evaluate whether this was true. The company had done some very general surveys where people would say things like, this employee support program is the single best benefit the company offers. This made the executives very angry because legally an employee assistance or support program cannot be classified as a benefit. But they liked the idea that employees saw this as something that the company was doing to help them out. And so we interviewed employees all around these different retail stores at this company. We interviewed managers. We did a national survey. And we were trying to figure out what is it that actually drives employees' commitment to the company when they have a chance to be part of this employee support program. And it wasn't what we thought. It also wasn't what the executives and managers who were helping us on this study actually thought. It was actually that the commitment was really caused by giving support, not by receiving it. And so what would happen was employees who had a chance to give time or give money to the program felt like their jobs and the company's actions were really making a difference. And we got a lot of quotes that I think illustrated this theme. This was one of my favorites, where an employee said, I wasn't originally planning to donate, but I heard about this program, and I heard about the fact that I had coworkers in need. And when I started donating, I began to see that business can make you very focused on money. And this kind of gave me an opportunity to focus on other people in need and to sort of step out of the normal logic of business and express my more caring side. And what was really fascinating about this is that in our survey study, we found that the amount of support that you received from the company had no relationship to your commitment whatsoever, nor did the amount of support that you expected to receive from this program. The only driver was how much time and how much money had you given. And both of those things, again, helped employees see themselves in more caring terms, as well as seeing the company in more caring terms. Now, I loved this finding because it was a radical redirection of what the company was planning to do with this program. So they were trying to take a step back and say, OK, we want to sort of rethink how do we manage this? Where should we go? And what they were planning to do was basically create more opportunities for employees to receive support. So expanding the range of events that you can get help with, the kinds of situations that the company will support you for. And we said, yeah, that might be important, but you also actually need to give employees more opportunities to contribute and give support, whether that means more opportunities to donate out of your paycheck, more ways for employees to help out with fundraising or volunteering. And sort of going back to my call center studies, some really powerful, inspiring stories about how coworkers have been helped, of course, with confidentiality protected as necessary in a lot of the way the program operates. And I think the overall conclusion that we drew from this project is that when you take employees who are doing sort of more ordinary everyday jobs, who feel that their daily actions don't make a huge difference, that this kind of support program and the opportunity to contribute was a substitute. That it gave them the sense that even though their daily job didn't necessarily make a huge difference, their involvement with the company still did, and gave them a different outlet for really having an impact. And so the general summary that I want to offer is I think there are a couple ways that you as a leader or a manager can think about outsourcing your own inspiration. If you're working with people who have a meaningful impact, the question is, are there any clients, any customers, any patients, or other end users that they don't get to see? And how can you establish that connection? If you've got employees like my lifeguards who have really high potential impact, but it never actually happens, where are the most similar examples that you can bring in, whether it's stories or other people's experiences, so they can live it vicariously and see it for themselves? If you've got people who have so much impact on a daily basis, like our medical professionals, that they almost forget about how every action matters, I think this is a time where you really want to reinforce it and draw people's attention in ways that remind them of how much of a difference their work really makes. And then I think if you've got employees whose daily jobs really lack a high level of impact, I think this is where corporate social responsibility, philanthropy, volunteering, and other ways to participate in the company's giving efforts really matter the most as a substitute. And so just a quick word on next steps for projects. Frank told us to be very direct with requests for help, so I'll try that. I'm just starting 2 projects right now, and I haven't found quite the right organization for either of them yet. So if your organization is one, I'd love to talk further about it. One is to really look at corporate philanthropy or corporate social responsibility or giving as a source of employee motivation. There's a ton of evidence that's been gathered over the past 20 years or so that when a company is socially responsible and philanthropic, employees are more likely to apply, they're more likely to come, they're more likely to stay. There's not any evidence, to the best of my knowledge, that they actually work harder or more effectively when the company undertakes corporate social responsibility. And I want to change that by trying to think about how do we design these programs in a way that not only bring employees and attach them to the organization, but actually motivate them to work harder and more successfully. And then I'm also really interested in doing some follow-up studies, much like the fundraiser type, where we think about people who really do high impact work but don't get to see it directly. And study how that has important implications for revenue, but also for customer service or creativity and innovation, or maybe even turnover and retention. I should say related to that people always want to know with the fundraisers what happened to turnover. So I said there was a 350% annual turnover rate. Now you get to meet this scholarship student. You find out, wow, your work really makes a difference. Do you stay longer? The answer is no, the job still sucks. But while you're there, you're willing to work a lot harder until you can no longer tolerate it. And I think that's the sad hidden side of this work. But we're also dealing with callers who are doing part-time jobs and have other options that might be more motivating. And I'd really love to work with an organization where people are working full-time and see whether connecting employees or volunteers to their impact really helps to retain them. So thank you all so much. I'd love to take questions and chat further for those of you who are interested. Yes.
You know, that example of the callers really kind of reinforced this one truism. And when they say, you know, when you're hiring marketing people or hiring salespeople, you look for people who really believe in your product. That they're the best salespeople are going to be the people who genuinely believe. So that kind of reinforced to me that example. Are there other ways that people can believe in a product other than, you know, these stories is certainly one way to do it. Are there other ways that people can go even deeper into that?
Yeah, so I think it's an interesting question, and it's not one that I've studied a lot. But one answer actually, and I'm sorry for the bad pun, but if you think about the Hair Club for Men, that old line about I'm not only the president, I'm also a client. I actually think there's a really powerful insight in that, which is that the people who can often appreciate the impact of a product or a service the most are those who have benefited from it, right? And so if you go back to our fundraiser study, the best callers in the call center were actual scholarship students who had received the money and then could really understand why it was so important to help other people get scholarships. The only problem was it's really hard to hire them because they're on scholarship and they don't need to work in this miserable job in order to support themselves. But yeah, I think that thinking about people who have already experienced the benefit firsthand is one way to help connect people to the impact of a product or service. I'm sure there are others, but I think that's the first one that comes to mind.
We're a nonprofit. We were going to ask our employees to provide them pay during, one day of volunteering per month. So I think I might try that because I think that'll make them a lot more empathetic to other nonprofits and people they serve.
Sounds great to me. I think the other thing that comes to mind is I think sort of a lot of what you see in the kinds of studies I've done is about sort of empathy and gratitude, right? So I see someone who either really needs help or has really benefited from help. And both of those things sort of reinforce my beliefs that my job makes a difference and that it's valuable to others. But there's another kind of mechanism at play here, and I think Microsoft has actually made this famous, that they believe that merely just seeing your customer, even if they don't have a huge need or if they're not tremendously grateful, can matter. And Chip Heath has a great story about this, where Microsoft had problems with software developers who essentially would design Windows software and other products that were not particularly user-friendly. And they would get surveys back that would say things like, about 6 out of 10 people said they couldn't figure out how to navigate the software. Like they couldn't find the start button back in the early 90s. And the developers would look at those survey data and they'd say, well, where did you find 6 idiots? Because this is so simple, right? And the idea, of course, is that a user obviously has a very different perspective than the developer. And so they built this Usability Test Lab. The whole purpose of it is for software developers to just watch users navigating the product and just see that they're normal human beings. They're not dumb. They just don't think about a computer program the same way that a developer does. And I haven't seen any hard data on this or any controlled experiments. But certainly Microsoft executives report that this is a really fundamental way to help developers think sort of about the perspectives of users more carefully. And so I think that little connection probably matters a whole lot. Others? Jamie?
Did it matter at all? So the example of using the fellows and having them, they didn't have the time to come in and actually they didn't need to do the phone banking work. But what about if you did say, well, like part of your contribution of the fellowship is that you do commit 50 hours to come in and do the phone bank with us? I mean, is that something that you would see it takes away the altruism from it so they don't work as high productivity, or is that something that could be seen effective?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. It's something we've tried at a couple other universities, and we see mixed results. So these kinds of interventions work best when people feel like they're making the voluntary choice because they believe in the cause or they care about the impact. And so once I start to require you to do it, we always take the risk that you're going to feel a stronger sense of pressure and that you're going to feel like you have to help instead of wanting to help. And that might lead you to sort of fulfill your commitment, but not necessarily go above and beyond. And that's what I've seen in a couple of the studies where we've looked at that. That certainly there's a benefit of getting them involved, but it's not quite as powerful or energizing or inspiring as when they really have chosen, sort of based on hearing the story and saying this really matters, to work harder. I will say, just as a footnote on that, though, that a lot of the callers won't admit that this is why they're working hard. And I think part of it is because they feel like it's not a pleasant job, and they'll look a little bit foolish or irrational if they say, yeah, I really care about these scholarship students, and so I'm going to take a lot of rejection for it. But what we do find is when we survey them after they met the scholarship students, they do feel that their work makes more of a difference. They feel that it's more valued, and they have a stronger sense of commitment to those people that they're helping that sort of keeps them going. So, yeah, Bobby?
Adam, in terms of the employee programs that were kind of a substitute for doing good if your job didn't actually do that, was there a difference between time versus money that the company offered? Did one trump the other?
It's a good question. So it was sort of hard to track that because we have a little bit of an apples and oranges situation. So how many units of time are equal to $1 given, right? And comparing those two things is really tricky. What we can do is we can look at employees who do both at different times and track which one is more predictive of their own commitment. And as you might expect, time mattered a lot more than money. And I think that it's consistent with some of what Kathleen talked about and also what Jennifer is going to tell you. That employees who spent time volunteering felt more psychologically engaged and committed to the experience, whereas the paycheck donation was actually done in such a way that you could sort of back to Eric's comments about defaults, you could check a box saying I want to donate every month, and you never saw it again. And 4 years later, you might still be giving $1 every paycheck, and you don't even remember it, which made it hard for that experience to really sort of take hold in the same way that giving time does. I will say, though, that there were still some benefits from giving money. They were just a little bit weaker. But the fact that the company was matching helped a lot of employees feel like, if they contributed to this cause, not only were they helping their fellow coworkers inside the organization who they felt a special need to care about, but also they were really in a situation where they were able to say, okay, this is going a lot further than it would if I gave to some other cause. And so the matching seemed to be a pretty big driver of those effects. Thank you.